The rain fell like shattered glass across the battlefield, each drop reflecting the orange glow of fires that refused to die. Sienna Vex moved through the carnage with practiced efficiency, her rifle sweeping across the devastation, while her boots splashed through puddles turned crimson. The battle for the Korvath refineries had ended 3 hours ago, but the dying took longer to finish. Her species, the Kethrani, had won this particular engagement. Not that victory meant much anymore. After 6 years of war, triumph was just another word for surviving until tomorrow. Sienna's silver-blue skin was streaked with mud and worse, her combat armor scored by weapons fire that had come too close. At 28 cycles old, she'd spent a quarter of her life learning how to kill humans efficiently. The refineries smoldered behind her, their skeletal structures reaching toward a smoke-darkened sky. Somewhere in the ruins, her unit was securing the perimeter and cataloging the dead. Sienna had volunteered for sweep duty, checking for survivors among the fallen. It was grim work, but someone had to do it, and she preferred solitude to the forced camaraderie of her squadmates. She found him in the shadow of a collapsed fuel tank, half buried under twisted metal and concrete debris. At first, she thought he was dead. His armor was cracked open like an egg, medical foam leaking from the seams in pink-tinged streams. His face was pale beneath the grime, lips blue, breathing shallow and ragged. Human. Enemy. Target. Sienna raised her rifle, finger settling on the trigger with familiar weight. One shot, clean and quick. Mercy, by any definition. The man's eyes flickered open, and she froze. They were green. Deep green, like the forests of her homeworld before the war had reached them. For a moment suspended in time, they simply stared at each other. Killer and victim, enemy and enemy, two people caught in a machine neither of them had built, but both were trapped inside. "Do it," he whispered, voice rough as gravel. Blood flecked his lips. "I'm dead anyway." Sienna's finger tightened on the trigger. This was the smart play, the safe play, the only play that made sense. The war had taught her that hesitation killed, that mercy was a luxury neither side could afford. She'd executed wounded enemies before, had watched her friends die from similar acts of misplaced compassion by soldiers who'd let injured enemies live long enough to detonate grenades. But something in his eyes stopped her. Not fear, which she could have handled. Not hatred, which she understood. It was resignation, a bone-deep weariness that mirrored her own. This man wasn't looking at an alien monster. He was looking at another soldier, equally exhausted, equally trapped. "Your name," she said, surprising herself. He blinked slowly, confusion cutting through the pain. "What? Tell me your name." "Marcus." A cough racked his body, and fresh blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Marcus Hayes, Lieutenant, Human Colonial Marines." "Serial number." "I don't need your serial number." Sienna lowered her rifle fractionally, her tactical implant screaming warnings about response times and proper protocols. "Can you move?" "My legs are ... Marcus tried to shift and went white, biting back a scream. "Crushed. I can't feel them." Sienna's combat scanner confirmed what she already suspected. Both femurs shattered, massive internal bleeding, collapsed lung, probable spinal damage. Even with immediate medical attention, his chances were minimal. And they were in the middle of a war zone, 3 kilometers from the nearest human position, and surrounded by her own forces. She should kill him. Every regulation, every tactical consideration, every lesson she'd learned said to pull the trigger and move on. Instead, she found herself holstering her weapon and moving closer. "What are you doing?" Marcus watched her approach with wary confusion. Something incredibly stupid. Sienna activated her armor's strength enhancers and gripped the edge of the metal, pinning him down. "When I lift this, you're going to hurt. Don't scream." "Wait, you can't," she heaved, and the debris shifted with a groan of protesting metal. Marcus went rigid, his jaw locked tight as agony rolled through him in visible waves. To his credit, he didn't scream. When the weight lifted, he gasped like a drowning man breaking the surface. Sienna didn't give herself time to reconsider. She pulled an emergency medical wrap from her kit and bound his legs with quick, efficient movements. It wouldn't heal him, but it might keep him from bleeding out in the next few minutes. Then she hauled him up in a fireman's carry, his weight settling across her shoulders as her armor's servos whined in protest. "You're insane," Marcus managed between gasps of pain. "They'll execute you for this?" "Probably." Sienna checked her tactical display, calculating routes and patrol patterns. Her unit thought she was doing sweep duty in Sector 7. She had maybe 20 minutes before anyone questioned her position. "There's a place. Old Kethrani Research Facility, abandoned before the war. If I can get you there ... Why?" The question came out barely above a whisper. Why save an enemy? Sienna started moving, picking her way through the ruins with careful steps. Rain continued to fall, washing some of the blood from her armor. In the distance, she could hear the sound of transport ships arriving, her people consolidating their hold on the territory. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Maybe I'm tired of being the person who pulls the trigger. Maybe I need to believe we're still capable of being more than killers." She adjusted his weight, feeling him shudder against her. "Or maybe I just saw something in your eyes that reminded me I used to be someone else, before all this." Marcus didn't respond, either unconscious or conserving his strength. Sienna moved through the darkness, heading away from her unit, away from safety, toward the abandoned research facility she'd discovered during a previous operation. It was a desperate gamble, treason by any definition, and would likely get them both killed. But for the first time in 6 years, Sienna felt like she was making a choice that was actually hers. Not the wars, not her commanders, not the endless machine of violence that had consumed her world. Just hers. The facility emerged from the rain like a ghost, its walls covered in creeping vines and rust. Sienna carried Marcus through the broken entrance, her armor's lights cutting through the darkness. Inside, the air was cool and stale, untouched by the war outside. She found what she was looking for in the sub-basement, a cryogenic storage array, ancient but still functional. The Kethrani had used these facilities for long-term medical storage before the war had made such luxuries irrelevant. Power still hummed through the walls, drawn from geothermal sources that would last centuries. Sienna laid Marcus in one of the pods, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she initialized the medical systems. The pod's diagnostic scanners swept over him, cataloging his injuries with cold precision. Critical condition. Survival probability without intervention, 4%. With cryogenic suspension, 67%. Not great odds, but better than dying in the rain. "This will put you to sleep," she explained, knowing he probably couldn't hear her anymore. "The pod will stabilize you, keep you alive until someone can help you." Until when? Until the war ended? Until she could find a way to get him proper medical care? Until some impossible future where saving an enemy soldier didn't mean signing her own death warrant? Sienna didn't have answers, only the growing certainty that she couldn't let this man die. Marcus's eyes opened, one last time as the preservation mist began to fill the chamber. They found hers through the frosting viewplate, and she saw understanding there. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acknowledgement. Whatever happened next, they were bound together now by this moment. This choice, Sienna pressed her palm against the glass as the pod sealed. "If I survive this war," she whispered to his sleeping form, "I'll come back for you. I promise." The pod hummed to life, joining the facility's background chorus of machinery. Marcus's vital signs dropped to minimal levels as the cryogenic process took hold. suspending him in the space between life and death. Sienna sealed the chamber, erasing every trace of their passage with the thoroughness of someone who knew exactly how thorough her people's investigations would be. Then she walked back into the rain, back toward her unit, carrying a secret that would either destroy her or give her a reason to survive the years ahead. She never told anyone about that night. Not when her squadmates asked why she looked so shaken. Not when the medals came for her actions during the battle. Not when the war ground on, year after year, consuming everything in its path, but sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn. Sienna would think about green eyes and a promise made to someone she should have killed. And she would wonder if mercy was just another word for hope, fragile and foolish, and absolutely necessary for survival. The years crawled by like wounded animals, each one leaving deeper scars on Sienna's soul. She returned to her unit that night, rain-soaked and trembling, with a story about equipment malfunction and getting separated during the sweep. Her squad leader, a grizzled veteran named Torvin, had given her a long look but asked no questions. In war, sometimes it was better not to know. The first year was the hardest. Every patrol near the old research facility sent her heart racing. Every investigation into missing equipment or unexplained power signatures made her certain they'd found him. She dreamed of Marcus Hayes dying alone in that pod because of her cowardice, or worse, waking up confused and terrified with no one to explain what had happened. But the facility remained undiscovered, hidden in a sector both sides had abandoned after the refineries fell. The war moved on, as wars do, finding fresh ground to poison and new lives to consume. Sienna moved with it. She fought in the siege of Helion Ridge, where the human forces held for 36 days before collapsing. She survived the chemical attacks at Deepwater Basin, where entire battalions on both sides drowned in their own melting lungs. She earned commendations for valor, promotions for tactical brilliance, and the quiet respect of soldiers who recognized someone who'd stared into the abyss and kept fighting anyway. But every victory felt hollow. Every enemy she killed carried Marcus's green eyes. By the third year, the nightmares had become routine. She'd dream of the pod malfunctioning, of finding him thawed and rotted, of his voice asking why she'd saved him, only to let him die slowly. She'd wake gasping, her roommate Petra asking if she was all right, and she'd lie and say it was just combat stress. Everyone had combat stress. It was practically a uniform requirement. The war itself began to change. What had started as a territorial dispute over colonial rights had metastasized into something darker. Both sides spoke of extinction-level threats and final solutions. Propaganda painted the enemy as monsters beyond redemption. Sienna watched her people, the Kethrani, grow harder and more desperate with each passing cycle. She made excuses to patrol near the facility whenever possible. Just checking, she'd tell herself. Just making sure. The building remained untouched, a tomb for her greatest secret and her last shred of hope that she was still capable of being something other than a weapon. 5 years after that night in the rain, Sienna earned her 3rd commendation and her 1st command. They gave her a tactical unit, 20 soldiers who looked at her with the kind of trust she no longer believed she deserved. Her first mission briefing included intelligence about human supply lines and suggestions for maximum casualties. She led her unit with calculated precision, choosing targets that mattered strategically while avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. Her superiors praised her efficiency. Her soldiers praised her for bringing them home alive. No one noticed that Lieutenant Sienna Vex never quite smiled at the body counts anymore. The war ground into its 7th year, then its 10th. Sienna stopped counting after that. Time became measured in battles survived rather than cycles passed. Her silver-blue skin accumulated scars that even regenerative medicine couldn't fully erase. Her eyes developed the 1,000-yard stare common to soldiers. who'd seen too much, but she never forgot the promise made to a dying human soldier in an abandoned facility she visited when she could. Always careful, always cautious. The pod's status lights continued their patient blinking, reporting stable suspension and nominal functions. Marcus Hayes slept on, unaware that the war he'd left behind had grown into something monstrous, that the woman who'd saved him was becoming someone she barely recognized. 15 years in, something shifted in Sienna's unit. They were stationed near the old battlefield where she'd found Marcus, assigned to defensive positions against an expected human offensive. The proximity felt like fate, or perhaps just the universe's dark sense of humor. Her second in command, a young soldier named Rin, noticed her distraction. "You all right, Lieutenant? You keep staring at that old research sector." "Just thinking," Sienna replied, forcing her attention back to the tactical displays. "That facility might make a good fallback position if we're overrun. It's been abandoned for years. Probably structural damage, maybe traps. Maybe, but we should know our terrain." She marked it on their maps, ensuring her people would avoid it. The last thing she needed was someone stumbling onto her secret. The offensive came 3 days later with brutal intensity. Human forces had developed new weapons, plasma artillery that turned Kathrani defensive positions into molten slag. Sienna's unit fought desperately, falling back through sectors they'd held for months, watching their lines collapse under the onslaught. During a brief respite, Rin found her in a bombed-out bunker, staring at the tactical map with hollow eyes. "We're losing, aren't we?" "Not just this battle. Everything." Sienna looked at the younger soldier, seeing her own exhaustion reflected back. Wars don't get lost in a day. They get lost in 1,000 small decisions, 1,000 moments where we chose violence over understanding. "That's not very inspiring, Lieutenant." "No," Sienna agreed quietly. "But it's true." 20 years after saving Marcus Hayes, Sienna was promoted again. They made her a tactical coordinator, responsible for entire battle groups rather than individual units. The promotion came with access to strategic intelligence, and what she learned kept her awake at night, that the war was escalating toward something final. Both sides were developing weapons that made previous atrocities look gentle by comparison. Biological agents, orbital bombardment platforms, nanoplague vectors that could sterilize entire continents. The brass on both sides spoke in terms of acceptable losses measured in billions. Sienna spent her rare leave time in the archives, researching everything she could about long-term cryogenic suspension. How long could the pods last? What were the failure rates? Could someone survive decades in frozen sleep, or would they wake damaged beyond repair? The medical literature offered both hope and horror. The pods were designed for century-long suspension, but that assumed regular maintenance and optimal conditions. Environmental factors, power fluctuations, even cosmic radiation could cause cascade failures. The longer someone slept, the higher the risk of complications. She returned to the facility after 23 years, moving through the ruins with the paranoia of someone who'd survived too long to trust easy paths. The pod still hummed with patient power, Marcus's frozen form unchanged by the years outside. His face, visible through the frost, looked peaceful, younger than she felt, untouched by the decades that had carved away her innocence. "Still sleeping," she whispered to the empty chamber. "Lucky you? You don't have to see what we've become." But guilt gnawed at her. Had she saved him only to trap him in a nightmare without end? Was this mercy, or just another flavor of cruelty? She reached out to the pod's control interface, fingers hovering over the revival sequence, then pulled back. Not yet. He deserved better than waking to this. The war's 30th anniversary passed without celebration. By then, both sides had lost track of why they'd started fighting. New generations had grown up knowing nothing but conflict. Children learned to handle weapons before they learned to read. Propaganda had replaced history, and hatred had become so normalized that peace seemed like a foreign concept. Sienna, now in her late 50s, had become something of a legend. The soldier who'd fought in every major campaign, who'd survived battles that had killed thousands, who never seemed to break no matter how much pressure the war applied. They gave her medals she didn't want and asked for speeches she couldn't stomach giving God in private. She was falling apart. The weight of her secret, combined with the accumulating horror of 3 decades of warfare, pressed down on her like a physical thing. She'd saved one life while taking hundreds. The mathematics of that didn't balance, no matter how she tried to justify it. Pitra, her old roommate and one of her few remaining friends, found her drunk one night in their quarters. "You can't keep doing this to yourself, Sienna. Whatever's eating you, you need to let it go. What if I can't?" Sienna stared at the bottom of her glass. What if the thing eating me is the only proof I was ever human enough to do something, right? Then you're already dead. You just haven't stopped moving yet. The words haunted her for years after. 40 years in, the war reached Sienna's homeworld. She watched from orbit as human forces bombarded the cities where she'd grown up, turning her childhood into radioactive craters. The Kethrani retaliated against human colonies with equal brutality. The cycle of atrocities had become so normalized that news reports listed civilian casualties with the same casual tone as weather forecasts. She requested reassignment to frontline duty, hoping that maybe exhaustion would give her the peace that nothing else had. Her superiors denied the request. She was too valuable as a coordinator, they said. Her tactical experience saved more lives than her rifle ever could. So she sat in command centers, watching battles unfold on holographic displays, moving units like game pieces while trying not to think about the lives those pieces represented. And every few months, when she could manage it, she'd return to that abandoned facility to check on the human soldier she'd saved a lifetime ago. The pod's diagnostic systems reported everything normal. Suspension stable. Life signs nominal. Subject unaware of the passage of time. Marcus Hayes slept through the death of the world he'd known, preserved in amber while everything he'd fought for crumbled to dust. Sienna envied him. By year 50, she'd stopped counting. Time had become meaningless, just an endless succession of battles that blurred together into one long nightmare. She was 68 years old, ancient by Kethrani military standards, still fighting a war she no longer believed in for reasons she couldn't articulate. Her body was breaking down despite the best medical technology could offer. Old injuries that should have healed ached in the cold. Her hands shook when she thought no one was watching. She'd lost so many friends that she'd stopped learning the names of new soldiers, knowing they'd probably die before she had time to care. The war had taken everything from her except the one secret she'd kept for half a century. Some nights, that felt like the only thing keeping her sane. The knowledge that once, a lifetime ago, she'd chosen mercy over murder. That for one moment, she'd been better than what the war demanded. The world ended on a Tuesday, though Sienna only knew it was Tuesday because her neural implants still tracked such meaningless details. 250 years had passed since that rain-soaked night, when she'd made a choice that had defined the rest of her impossibly long life. The Kethrani had developed life extension treatments in year 70 of the war, desperate to preserve their dwindling population of experienced soldiers. Sienna had become a relic, a living fossil who'd watched generations rise and fall while the war consumed everything. She stood at the edge of what had once been New Sanctuary, the last major Kethrani city, and watched it burn. The flames weren't even real fire anymore, some kind of plasma reaction that turned buildings to vapor and left shadows burned into the ground where people had stood. The human forces, or what passed for human forces now, had finally developed weapons that could crack continental plates. The Kathrani had responded with biological agents that rewrote DNA on contact. There would be no winners. Only different speeds of dying. Sienna's armor was ancient, patched and repatched so many times it was more repair than original material. Her face, reflected in a piece of broken glass, belonged to someone in their early 30s, thanks to the treatments, but her eyes told the truth. She'd lived too long, seen too much, carried her secret for 2.5 centuries, while the universe found new and creative ways to justify her decision to save one enemy soldier. The tactical display in her helmet showed what remained of Kathrani. Civilization, scattered refugee camps, 3 cities under siege, and approximately 14,000 soldiers still combat-capable across the entire planet. The humans weren't doing much better. Both species had fought themselves to the edge of extinction over a conflict that had outlived everyone who'd started it. Sienna checked her chronometer. She had maybe 6 hours before the plasma bombardment reached her position. 6 hours to make a choice she'd been avoiding for 250 years. The journey to the facility took 4 of those hours. The landscape had changed so drastically she barely recognized it. The battlefield where she'd found Marcus was now a crystallized wasteland, the sand fused to glass by repeated orbital strikes. The refineries had been vapor for a century. Even the mountains had been reshaped by weapons that treated geology as a suggestion. But the research facility remained, hidden in a geological formation that had somehow survived the apocalypse. Sienna moved through the ruins with the careful paranoia of someone who'd stayed alive by never trusting the obvious path. Her scanner detected automated defenses from both sides. Hunter-killer drones that had outlived their masters, still following protocols written by the long dead. She bypassed them with techniques learned over centuries, feeling like a ghost haunting the graveyard of her own life. The facility entrance was exactly where she remembered, though now it was covered in strange crystalline growths that had learned to feed on radiation. She burned them away with her plasma cutter and descended into the darkness. The air inside tasted stale, but breathable. Emergency lighting flickered to life as she moved deeper, ancient systems waking at her presence. Her heartbeat accelerated with each step, a physiological response she couldn't quite control despite all her experience. After 250 years, she was going to see him again. The man she'd saved, the promise she'd kept, the man who represented the last moment. She'd been capable of hope that the cryopod waited in the deepest chamber, its status lights still blinking their patient rhythm. Sienna approached slowly, almost afraid to look, terrified she'd find the pod dark and Marcus long dead from some cascade failure she'd never detected. But the displays showed green, suspension stable, all systems nominal. After 2.5 centuries, he was still alive. Sienna's hands shook as she initiated the revival sequence. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, but reality felt surreal, like she was watching herself from outside her body. The pod began its wake-up protocols with mechanical precision, atmosphere cycling, temperature rising, preservation mist venting through filters clogged with centuries of dust. She'd meant to be calm, professional. She'd meant to ease him into the reality of what had happened. But as Marcus's eyes snapped open with the violent alertness of a soldier expecting combat, centuries of loneliness crashed down on her all at once. She wasn't the controlled tactical coordinator who'd survived 250 years of war. She was 28 years old again, making an impossible choice in the rain. Marcus. The word tore from her throat as his hands shot out reflexively, searching for weapons that weren't there. His eyes were wild, unfocused, seeing ghosts from a battle that had ended 2.5 centuries ago. Marcus, please, contact. Enemy contact. His voice was raw, damaged by the long sleep, but the training was pure muscle memory. He tried to roll out of the pod, and his legs buckled, sending him sprawling onto the cold floor. Peterson. Rodriguez. Fall back to. They're gone. Sienna dropped to her knees beside him, her composure shattering. She grabbed his shoulders, shaking him desperately. Marcus, you have to focus. They found us. They're coming. But he wasn't seeing her. His eyes were locked on something 250 years in the past, reliving the moment she'd found him. The explosion. The beam crushing his legs. His squad dying around him while he lay helpless. She could see the terror and rage warring in his expression. The absolute confusion of a mind trying to reconcile the last thing it remembered with the impossibility of now. No. No, no. Marcus's hands clawed at the ground, trying to pull himself toward a weapon that didn't exist. Toward squadmates who'd been dust for centuries. We had orders. We had to hold the refineries. We had to. Marcus, look at me. Sienna's voice cracked with desperation. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She'd imagined this meeting so many times, planned what she'd say, how she'd explain. But faced with his raw panic, all her carefully constructed speeches evaporated. Please, you have to calm down. I know you're confused, but we don't have time. His gaze suddenly snapped to her face, and for the first time, he seemed to actually see her. Recognition dawned slowly, painfully, like watching ice crack under pressure. The blue-skinned alien soldier who should have killed him, who'd stood over him with a rifle, who'd made the choice to save instead of end. You. The word came out barely above a whisper. Marcus's breathing was ragged, his whole body trembling. The Kathrani soldier. You pulled me out. You. What did you do to me? Sienna felt tears on her face and was surprised to realize she was crying. When had she last cried? I saved you. I put you in cryogenic suspension. I didn't know what else to. How long? Marcus interrupted, his soldier's mind starting to work through the panic. He looked around the chamber with growing horror, seeing the decay, the age, the way time had transformed everything. How long was I asleep? Sienna's throat closed. This was the moment she dreaded for 2.5 centuries. 250 years. The color drained from Marcus's face. That's not possible. That can't be. Your war ended 170 years ago? Sienna continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. Everyone you knew is dead. Everyone I knew is dead. The planet has been fighting for so long that we can't even remember what started it anymore. And now we're losing. Both sides are losing. In a few hours, the bombardment will reach this sector and stop. Marcus held up a hand, his expression moving through shock toward something harder. Just stop talking for a second. I need to. He tried to stand again, and this time managed it, though he swayed dangerously. His hands explored his body, checking for injuries that had healed centuries ago. For armor that had long since been discarded, Sienna watched him process. Seeing the moment when the full horror of his situation hit. 250 years. Everyone gone. Everything changed. Waking from what should have been death into a nightmare worse than anything he could have imagined. You should have let me die. Marcus's voice was flat, emotionless in the way of someone in shock. On that battlefield. You should have pulled the trigger. I know. Sienna stood slowly, keeping her distance. I've thought that 1,000 times. But I couldn't. I looked at you, and I couldn't. Why? The question exploded from him with sudden fury. Why save an enemy? Why drag me forward into this? What possible reason? Because I needed to believe we were better than what the war made us. Sienna shouted back, her own control finally breaking completely. Because every night I pulled the trigger on dying soldiers and told myself it was mercy, and I needed to know that at least once I could choose differently. Because you looked at me and I saw another person instead of a target, and I couldn't kill that. I couldn't kill the only thing in 6 years that had felt human. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at her, and Sienna stared back. Two people separated by species and centuries, and an unbridgeable gulf of trauma. Connected only by a choice made on a battlefield neither of them would ever forget. You said they found us, Marcus said finally, his voice quieter now. Who found us? Sienna laughed bitterly. Does it matter? Take your pick. My people consider me a traitor for what I did. Your people would kill you on sight for collaborating with the enemy. There are automated hunter-killer drones that don't care about species, just eliminating unauthorized life forms. The planet itself is dying, poisoned by 250 years of chemical warfare and biological agents. She met his eyes. I woke you because I'm out of options and running out of time, and because I owed you the truth. You deserve to know that someone thought your life was worth saving, even if I was wrong. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his soldier's mind clearly working through the tactical situation. How long do we have? Before the bombardment? Maybe 2 hours now. And you came here to warn me? To wake me up just so I could die properly this time? No. Sienna pulled up her tactical display, showing him the route she'd plotted. There's a place. A settlement in the northern wastes where refugees from both species are trying to survive without the war. It's a long shot, but it's something. I came here because... She faltered, then forced herself to continue. Because I've carried you with me for 250 years. And I couldn't let you die alone in the dark without knowing that someone remembered you mattered. Marcus studied the route, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up at her, and something in his eyes had softened. That's the craziest rescue plan I've ever heard. I've had 2.5 centuries to plan it. And you waited until the last possible second? I was hoping the war would end. Sienna's smile was broken. Stupid, I know. Marcus took a step toward her, wobbling slightly on legs that hadn't been used in centuries. Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, Human Colonial Marines. Or at least I used to be. He held out his hand. I don't know if I should thank you or hate you for this. But since we're apparently running from an apocalypse together, we should probably at least be on a first-name basis. Sienna looked at his offered hand. This gesture of reconciliation from a man who had every right to despise her. Slowly, she reached out and took it, feeling the warmth of living flesh against her own. Sienna Vex, former lieutenant, former tactical coordinator, current traitor to everything I was supposed to be. Well, Sienna Vex, Marcus said, and despite everything, the horror, the confusion, the sheer impossibility of their situation, there was the ghost of a smile on his face. Since you went to all the trouble of keeping me alive for 2.5 centuries, we should probably try not to waste it. Where do we run? Sienna felt something crack in her chest, some wall she'd built to survive centuries of war. Together, she said quietly. We run together. They left the facility side by side, climbing back toward a world that wanted them both dead, carrying between them a secret that had outlived empires and a promise that maybe, somehow, survival was still possible. Behind them, the cryopod powered down for the last time. Its purpose fulfilled, its vigil ended. The sky above them burned with the colors of approaching bombardment. But for the first time in 250 years, Sienna Vex wasn't running alone. And Marcus Hayes, impossibly awake in an impossible future, discovered that sometimes the hardest thing to survive isn't the war itself, but the hope that comes after.